motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 700682 relating to humanitarian obligations to Gaza. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms McVeigh. The petition was started in January 2025 and is named Urgently Fulfil Humanitarian Obligations to Gaza and reads, Act to ensure delivery of fuel, food, aid, life-saving services, etc. We think this shouldn't be dependent on condition of Israeli facilitation, as the Knesset voted against United Nations Relief and Works Agency access to Gaza. We think if military delivery of aid, airdrops, peacekeepers, etc. are needed, then all be considered. The petition further stated that Israel does not agree to ceasefire and does not permit United Nations Relief and Works Agency access. We think the UK must find alternative means to deliver aid. We believe this must be done urgently and with urgent deadlines, with or without Israeli support. In August, the government responded to this petition, where they noted that the Integrated Food Security Phase classification had issued an alert warning that the worst-case scenario of famine is unfolding. They also noted that all routes to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza are controlled by and must be approved by the Government of Israel. And so the UK has collaborated with regional partners on alternative routes for aid to get into Gaza, including airdrops and a maritime corridor. I believe this conflict has touched many people across the world. I am sure that every member in this room will have received high numbers of correspondence from constituents about the ongoing situation. I know that this is a topic my constituents care about deeply, and I am proud to be representing their views, as well as those of the nearly 200,000 people who signed this petition. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for bringing forward this debate, and she mentions the amount of people signing this petition. 715 people signed it from my own constituency. They will have given money to many of the UK aid agencies who are trying to get this aid in urgently. Would she agree with me that it's really a measure of success of the British government's work with the Civil Military Coordination Centre that is and that all the aid gets in urgency, which is a measure of success in working with that organisation?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention and for highlighting those important facts, and I do agree with the points raised. I was contacted by a constituent on Friday who said, we are still not seeing enough food, medicine, tents or machinery required to clear roads, excavate bombed buildings to recover the dead, restore water and electricity and sewage treatment facilities being allowed through the Israeli blockade. I implore you to use all the influence you have to pressure the Prime Minister to, at the very least, publicly call out the atrocities that continue in Gaza. And I receive many emails with that sentiment. Since October 7th, 2023, in Israel, approximately 2,000 Israelis have been killed, including civilians and IDF soldiers, and over 20,000 IDF soldiers have been injured. The Palestinian figures are as follows. Almost 70,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip, and over 170,000 have been injured. A UN impact report found that nearly 53% of these fatalities have been women, children and elderly people. I will give way.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady giving way, and she touches on there the burden that women and children are facing. And would you agree that with 123,000 pregnant women across the West Bank and Gaza living with severe malnutrition, inadequate medical care and soaring risks to themselves and their babies, that it's really incumbent on the government to provide as much aid as possible so those 123,000 pregnant women are supported?
Campbell.
I thank the honourable member for raising this really important issue, and I fully agree with what was raised. So it's important to remember that this is a situation which is fast-moving and can change from day to day. The humanitarian aid reaching Gaza has been intermittent and has started and stopped repeatedly. And it's vital to note, since the ceasefire, only a fraction of promised aid has actually reached Gaza. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Many of my constituents believe that UNRWA is best placed to deliver aid in Gaza. Does she agree with me that given that the determination of the ICJ was that Israel is under legal obligation to facilitate aid operations of UN agencies, including UNRWA, in the state of Palestine, that the UK government needs to take urgent action to ensure that its closest ally does act in accordance with that determination?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I agree with the points raised. I will be interested in hearing the Minister's response to this debate.
On the point of humanitarian aid, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for leading on this very important debate. But it's quite right that over 200,000 people have signed at relatively short notice this very important petition, because the reality is, as well as humanitarian aid clearly not getting, Israel continues to breach the ceasefire. Hundreds of Palestinians continue to die. Starvation and famine remain a reality for millions of Palestinians. Even basic needs like tents are not being provided, with children having to sleep in contaminated water, many thousands already at risk of disease. So will she agree with me that the UK government and the international community cannot continue to frankly look on as though the whole situation now has been resolved? And what we need is widespread sanctions against Israel in the same way the government has imposed, quite rightly, widespread sanctions against Russia for its war crimes in Ukraine. They need to do the same against Israel for its war crimes and continued genocide in Gaza.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and some of what you have raised will be said later on in this debate. But as I said previously, I think it will be important to hear the Minister's response to today's petitions debate. So I think I was at this. It's been intermittent. The humanitarian aid reaching Gaza has been intermittent and has started and stopped repeatedly. And it's vital to note that since the ceasefire, only a fraction of promised aid has actually reached Gaza. And I would like to state that I agree with the conclusion of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, which stated that Israel has committed genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. On August 22nd this year, the Integrated Food Security Phase classification confirmed that there is a famine taking place in the Gaza Governorate and that over 500,000 people face catastrophic conditions characterised by starvation, destitution and death. They also stated that restricted access to humanitarian and commercial supply of food and other essentials was a key driver of famine, saying since mid-March, access to both humanitarian and commercial supplies of food and other essential goods, including water, medicine, shelter and fuel, has remained critically restricted. A tactical pause announced on 27th of July failed to improve conditions as violence continued throughout the Strip, including airstrikes, shelling and shooting.
On that point, would she give way?
I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. In October of this year, I was pleased to meet, along with other parliamentarians, with a senior member of UNRWA as part of our work with the British group of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. And he told us how vital it was that UNRWA's programme of aid is restored absolutely fully, given the conditions that she and others have described. Would she agree with me that it's vital to restore that programme in full?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this point, and I fully agree with the point raised. So, the Director General of the World Health Organization stated there are no fully functioning hospitals in Gaza, and only 14 out of 36 are functioning at all. He also said that if you take the famine and combine it with a mental health problem, which we see as rampant, then the situation is a crisis for generations to come. The Public Health Report from the 13th of November attributed the weakened healthcare system to ongoing attacks and resource shortages, and the World Health Organization also found that there is a chronic shortage of essential medical equipment and medicines. Additionally, ongoing fuel shortages in Gaza have restricted the mobility of humanitarian aid and healthcare workers. As we are approaching winter and the weather is getting colder, the need for humanitarian aid intensifies. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs say that heavy rain has already affected over 13,000 households across the Gaza Strip, with hundreds of tents and makeshift shelters affected. And as time passes, the need for items such as tents, blankets and tarps will only increase. On the 6th of November 2025, the United Nations stated that Israeli authorities had rejected over 100 requests to bring relief materials into Gaza since the ceasefire began. And since the 10th of October, more than 6,490 metric tonnes of UN-coordinated relief materials have been denied entry into Gaza. Of these, over 3,700 metric tonnes were rejected on the grounds that the organisations were not authorised to bring relief items into Gaza. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving away. Now, to enable the safe transfer of aid, we must uphold the right to provide humanitarian relief to people in need. Now, my constituent, Louis Findlater, was on the recent aid flotilla, which came under drone attack, and Louis returned safely, but other volunteers were kidnapped and wrongfully detained. My other constituent, John Chapman, was delivering food with the World Central Kitchen when his convoy was struck by a missile from the IDF. There's been no formal apology for his death, no compensation for his family, and little accountability for his and other British aid volunteers who have died. Does my honourable friend therefore agree that humanitarian norms and red lines are not set in concrete, and that if we fail to secure accountability for these crimes and all the horrors of the past 2 years, the legacy of genocide in Gaza will be a concerning shift to a more dangerous world?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I agree with what he has said. So, importantly, this update noted that many international NGO partners continue to face difficulties in being registered in Israel, preventing them from bringing supplies into Gaza and operating at scale. And United Nations Relief and Works Association, UNRWA, continues to be banned by Israeli authorities from bringing in food and other supplies into Gaza. This is in reference to the October 2024 vote by the Israeli Parliament, which banned UNRWA from conducting any activity or providing any service in Israel, which includes the areas of annexed East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. Another UN impact report found that as of the 5th of November, 38% of households in Gaza and North Gaza governorates relied on humanitarian aid as their primary source of food, and 54% of households in Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis governorates relied on humanitarian aid as their primary source of food. Shockingly, they also found that more than 90% of children under 2 years old consume fewer than 2 food groups per day, with high-protein foods and micronutrient-rich items extremely scarce. Yet, in President Trump's 20-point Gaza peace plan, he specifies, upon acceptance of this agreement, full aid will be immediately sent into the Gaza Strip, and entry of distribution and aid in the Gaza Strip will proceed without interference from the two parties through the United Nations and its agencies and the Red Crescent, in addition to other international institutions not associated in any manner with either party. It's worth noting that the Prime Minister welcomed this news, adding, "This agreement must now be implemented in full, without delay, and accompanied by the immediate lifting of all restrictions on life-saving humanitarian aid to Gaza." Sadly, this has not happened. Both Israel and Hamas have accused each other of violating the ceasefire agreement since the 10th of October. However, I would like to highlight a case that constituents have written to me about. Just 8 days into the ceasefire, the Israeli military fired on a civilian vehicle, killing members of the Abu Shaban family, 7 children and 3 women, who were simply trying to check on their home. The areas still under Israeli occupation beyond the yellow line are not demarcated, and with limited internet access, civilians in Gaza may not know which areas are in or out of Israeli military control. Cases like this showcase how crucial it is that aid reaches Gaza and that peace is allowed to come to the region. The July 2024 ruling of the International Courts of Justice is key. The advisory opinion sets out various obligations in respect of third states, which includes the obligation to ensure Israel complies with international humanitarian law. It is very important to consider the International Development Committee's June 2025 report on their inquiry into UK humanitarian obligations. The report states that the UK has a legal obligation to both respect international humanitarian law and to ensure that it is respected in all circumstances, and that once impartial humanitarian relief schemes have been agreed to, the parties, whether or not parties to the armed conflict, must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of these relief schemes, subject to the right of control. I will give way.
Talking about the appalling impact of the lack of humanitarian aid in Gaza, especially on children. More than half the population of Gaza are children. But they have not only been missing food, they've been missing education for 2 years. I recently met Save the Children, who told me that 97% of Gaza's schools are in rubble, and the remaining 3% are used to house homeless people. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the future prospects of peace depend not only on getting life-saving humanitarian food in, but giving those children a future, which is why we've got to get those schools reopened as fast as possible?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I agree with absolutely everything that he has said.
Another intervention.
Absolutely.
My honourable friend has mentioned children. I met last night Mr. Dr. Mohammed Tahir. He's the doctor upon which the film The Mission is featured. In the film, he's operating on children with dead children at his feet, without the anaesthesia. Only 10% at best of medical supplies is getting through to Gaza at the moment. Can't our government do more to enforce a greater supply?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Minister's response in relation to the points that are being raised today. So, as the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs notes, United Nations Relief and Works Agency continues to be banned by Israeli authorities from bringing in food and other supplies to Gaza. This further complicates matters as it is incredibly important that aid is delivered by those who are trained to do so. Humanitarian aid is a specialist area, and organisations with experience cannot be simply replaced by others. On this point, there needs to be coordination on the access to aid to ensure that no single party has a monopoly or veto on what can enter Gaza. And in conclusion, the UK is a leader on the world stage, and British citizens are simply asking that we use our position to influence what needs to be done. I look forward to hearing the Minister's response, and I would ask the Minister to utilise the significant diplomatic and economic leverage that the UK possesses in order to do as much as possible to allow aid to those desperately in need and to alleviate suffering.
I remind members that should they wish to speak, they need to bob to be called in this debate. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 700682 relating to humanitarian obligations and Gaza. I know there's a lot wishing to speak, but I do believe there'll be enough time for everybody. Did I see Jeremy Corbyn wishing to speak? Yes? Then I called you.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. We'll be very, very brief, just to simply say this, that anyone who's observed Gaza over the past 18 months must be disgusted and appalled at what they've seen, what's happened, the deaths of children, the deaths of adults, and the continued bombardment, and the role that Britain has played in supplying arms to Israel, which have contributed to all of this. It is an utterly disgusting situation, and history is going to be very harsh on European and North American politicians who stood by and allowed these weapons to be supplied, knowing full well what was happening to them, and we're watching genocide on live television. When we come across whole families that have been destroyed by this, and this weekend I was reading, because I've got friends who send me stuff from the West Bank and from Gaza, of one man who is left looking after 26 grandchildren, because all his children have been killed. his partner's been killed, and all of his immediate family have been killed. And so he is an elderly man looking after 26 children. That is not an unusual situation. He has no money, he has no home, he's trying to build a tent to house them all. That's the reality of what's happened because of this bombardment. And of course,
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he explains in very vivid terms the reality of what is happening in Gaza, and also, as we've heard, in the West Bank as well. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the government of Israel is treating the international community with contempt, is treating the public who are concerned at the genocide the world over with contempt, and rather than treating the government of Israel with kid gloves, this government has a moral and legal obligation to introduce sanctions on Israel of the scale of those sanctions that were rightly brought on Russia, and a failure to do so will go down as a real abdication of moral and legal responsibility at this crucial time.
By any measurement of humanity, the people of Gaza have suffered as grievously as anyone has ever suffered in any conflict in the world. More than 60,000 already dead, and the rest living amongst rubble, starving, and without even being able to get the basic needs of medical attention, which the member for Hayes and Harlington pointed out affects children as well. And so we're looking at something that is utterly devastating. And the British government has been told many, many times. They resisted the calls for a ceasefire at the very beginning. We even had the now Prime Minister saying that it was a legitimate act of self-defence by Israel to deny food and water to people in Gaza. And so we have a pretty bad record by both British governments on this. And I would have thought the very least we can do now is say absolutely no arms of any sort or military cooperation with Israel. And the so-called ceasefire that the Trump plan is about is actually basically ensuring Israel's continued occupation of substantial parts of Gaza, and not saying very much about the abominable behaviour of the Israeli armed settlers on the West Bank, which are destroying villages and killing people as we speak. So surely we need to send a pretty strong message from this House that we recognise the rights of the Palestinian people to be able to live in peace. We also recognise the importance and the primacy of international law. The member who just intervened made a very strong point, and he and I have both been visiting the International Court of Justice at The Hague. I sat all through the hearing when South Africa made its application. It was a moving and fascinating experience, and brilliantly put by South Africa, who were condemned by members on all sides of this House for even bringing the case of genocide against Israel. And they put the case quite brilliantly. And I'm sitting there looking at this wonderful ceiling in the Palace of Peace and thinking back to the way when South Africa current leaders were all called terrorists and were denounced for undermining and upsetting the apartheid regime. They finished apartheid, and then they've given their support to the people of Palestine. Well done, South Africa, for having the bravery to do that. And so I think what we need to do is understand the importance of international law. If we believe in international law, which this Parliament and Britain always says it does, we helped to write the European Convention on Human Rights, we helped to write the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then stand by it. Stand by it and ensure that the Israeli government is taken to task for its breaches of human rights around the world. I'll give way to my friend here and then to my friend there.
Can I just reiterate the words of the Honourable Member that we cannot speak of recovery without first seeking and speaking of justice and accountability. Does the member agree that all alleged grave breaches of international law, including accusations of genocide, must be investigated and those responsible must be held to account? And the people of Gaza deserve immediate relief, but they also deserve a future built on justice. And does the member agree that peace is impossible without justice?
My friend, who's a lawyer himself and far better qualified than me on these matters, I would agree with him absolutely that justice requires that we act upon it. Otherwise, we undermine the whole principles of international law. And the fact that that international law might have a long arm reaching to us, to Britain, yes, to Britain, because we knowingly supplied weapons, knowing that a genocide was going on. That makes us complicit in that genocide.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. This issue has huge reach out. Here we are in London discussing it. But since I was re-elected last summer, I know that in Ullapool, in Wester Ross, very far from here, that every week there's a vigil held by concerned, decent people for the people of Gaza. So the milk of human kindness still flows, and we should take courage from that. Yeah.
I welcome my honourable friend's return to the House, but also the comments that he's just made. The issues surrounding support for Gaza have been incredible. Despite all the denunciations of all the demonstrations, the national demonstrations which are called Marches of Hate by the then Home Secretary, I've been on all 36 of them. I've spoken at every single one of them, and I continue to do it. But also I recognise that all over the country there are small and medium-sized demonstrations in often very small communities. And I think that there are well over 2 million people in this country that have shown some degree of support for the Palestinian people, either through meetings, marches, demonstrations, emails, petitions, letters, or a whole lot of things. It's moved people deeply. And I have to say, those demonstrations have made a difference. The rhetoric by both governments started to change. The bigger the demonstrations got, things have begun to change, and people begin to understand the horror of the life of the Palestinian people. I'll stop in a second because others wish to speak. I just want to finish with this point. It's going on to winter now in Gaza and the West Bank, and despite its latitude, it is actually very, very cold in winter. I recall once being an election observer in Gaza in January, and it was bitterly cold and horrible weather. That was long before this current bombardment. I thought it was terrible then. It's 1,000 times worse now. People are going to be dying of cold and hypothermia when there are stacks of tents on the other side of the border in Israel not being allowed in. The people are going to be dying of operations conducted without anaesthetic when there are plenty of anaesthetics available just across the border waiting to go in from Egypt. This is an abominable situation. Can't we just as a House say quite bluntly to Israel, you're wrong, what you're doing is illegal, what you're doing is immoral, and history will judge you for being the people that committed genocide against the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
Jazatwa.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I thank my honourable friend for North Ayrshire and Aaron for securing this debate. I'd like to turn the debate back to what it's supposed to be, which is the suffering in Palestine. For the people there, there's no ceasefire. Bloodshed, slaughter, starvation remain the reality on the ground. And since the ceasefire was supposedly agreed, 63 children have been killed according to UN sources. That's 2 children every day who've been murdered under the so-called ceasefire agreement. For those children who are alive, they're almost certainly suffering in some other way, injured, grieving, having lost their parents, friends or loved ones. Regardless of the constant violations, airstrikes, continued starvation, the illusion of a ceasefire has allowed many to take a moral holiday from the crisis in Palestine, patting themselves on the back as having solved this international crisis. Meanwhile, children are still paying the price, and most families in Gaza remain trapped in crowded makeshift camps with little or no aid. We must be under no false pretenses that as we approach winter, the situation for civilians will only get worse. In the last few weeks, flooding and rainstorm has plunged Gazans into further misery, destroying the little shelter they have left. Tents have been broken, mattresses have been soaked because Gaza's sanitation system has collapsed. Much of the water saturating tents, mattresses and even food supplies is contaminated with sewage. And there is virtually no dry land left, no new safe space to create new camps. There is nowhere else to go.
We cannot allow the pretence of a ceasefire to slow out efforts to fulfil the humanitarian obligations to Gaza, nor to excuse a lacklustre approach to supporting civilians. The humanitarian degradation and destruction in Gaza and the West Bank remain as urgent as ever. So I ask the Minister, because I know he cares immensely and he works tremendously hard, does he agree with me that we've entered a situation where the Israeli government can claim the moral high ground of operating under a ceasefire deal whilst continuing their assault on Gaza? And if so, what representations has he made to Israel and our American partners to urge Israel to act in accordance with its moral obligation under international and humanitarian law and let aid flow into Gaza? Thank you.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Pleasure to see you in the chair for this afternoon's hugely important debate. And I'd like to begin by thanking everyone from every corner of the UK who has signed this petition and who has essentially forced us into having this debate this afternoon. And I believe it is another perfect example of just how far ahead of the government and of this place generally, unfortunately, the people of these islands are when it comes to the plight of the beleaguered civilians of Gaza. And it demonstrates once again their desire to see peace, peace with justice for the Palestinian people. I think as never before have I witnessed such a sustained coming together of people and communities who are determined, in this case, to show solidarity with the victims of what can only be described as one of the greatest injustices of our time. And they're doing so because I believe that the people have decided that if 70,000 deaths, 200,000 injuries, having Gaza reduced to an uninhabitable wasteland, with the population in the midst of a man-made famine, with their medical infrastructure obliterated, and having the occupying power use water and electricity as a means of coercion and punishment, if that isn't enough to make their government act decisively, then they're going to do something themselves. Because the people can see that by denying food and medicine to the starving and the dying, repeatedly forcing the displacement of millions of civilians, it is beyond any dispute that Israel is in flagrant breach of the Genocide Convention and that the UK has failed abysmally in its legal obligation to both prevent and punish the crime of genocide. And by their actions, the people from across these islands are saying to their government, not in my name. And I would like to pay tribute to those groups in my own constituency of Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber, who have, over the past 2 years, organised, petitioned, prayed, raised awareness of and raised funds for the people of Gaza. Every single week there are events taking place, and I want to thank every one of those individuals involved for their humanitarianism and their determination not to turn a blind eye to the suffering and the injustice, as I fear far too many of us have been persuaded to do. In the past 3 weeks alone, community-led events in Oban, in Dunoon, in the Isle of Bute and in the village of Ardentiny have taken place. And I want to put on record my appreciation of the astonishing efforts of Catherine Wilkie, Graham McQueen, Marion Power, Dr Anna Learson from Oban Concern for Palestine, who raised more than £11,000 for medical aid for Palestinians at one fundraising event in the town a couple of weeks ago. A population of just 8,000 people raising that amount of money is absolutely remarkable. But they're not alone. Last week I spoke at an event organised by Father Roddy Macaulay and the parishioners of St Mun's in Dunoon, who are following a Mass for Justice and Peace and a lively discussion about how we can advance justice and peace in Palestine. A collection was taken for SCIAF's Gaza appeal. The same evening in Rothsay, the Isle of Bute Palestine Solidarity Group held a sold-out music event, raising almost £1,200 for humanitarian projects in Gaza. And the following day, in the tiny village of Ardentiny, Dinah MacDonald organised an afternoon of music with Rakita Kaur of the Argyll and Bute Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, where villagers raised funds for humanitarian aid. Now, these are just the ones I know about, that I'm sure there have been many others across Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber, where people and communities are refusing to sit back and, by their silence and inaction, allow the suffering of the people of Gaza to be conveniently forgotten about. And it confirms what I've known for the past 2 years, that the people of these islands, when it comes to supporting the defenceless civilians from genocide, they are miles ahead of this and the previous government. Because they know that, however welcome the arrival of a ceasefire might be, this crisis has not gone away. There are still millions suffering, millions of people suffering who desperately need our help. And given its shameful track record over the past 2 years, successive UK governments, they have to be held to account and never be allowed to give up on their moral responsibility to the people of Gaza. Because the people of these islands, they recognise that, unlike other one-off appeals made at times of a humanitarian crisis, this is not a natural disaster. This is an unnatural disaster, and it's been perpetrated by one of the UK's closest allies, while the UK government continues to provide them with political and military support. And it's not as if the UK government and the previous government do not know what Israel is doing. In May, the former Foreign Secretary, he openly acknowledged Israeli war crimes against the civilian population when he said the Israeli government's denial of food to hungry children is wrong, it is appalling. But it would appear it's not appalling enough to stop the supply of weapons. It's not appalling enough to end military cooperation. It's not appalling enough for the UK to make available the contents of those reconnaissance flights over Gaza to anyone bar the Israeli military. And it's not appalling enough for meaningful sanctions and a coordinated effort to end the siege and to have aid flood into Gaza free from Israeli control. It is inconceivable, Ms McVeigh, that the UK would have allowed any other state to act with the impunity with which it is allowing Israel to act. The UK rightly sanctioned Russia, but now stands accused, and rightly accused, of allowing a two-tier system of international law to operate. But the UK government's failure to put significant pressure on Israel to lift this siege is nothing new. Last year, as part of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I visited Al Arish on the Egyptian-Gaza border, where their warehouses were full of donated medical equipment, including wheelchairs, crutches, incubators, individual birthing kits for women in labour, medical cold storage boxes, generators and water storage bladders. And they were in those warehouses because the Israeli authorities had rejected out of hand the Red Crescent's application to deliver them to those most in need in Gaza. There were warehouses full of food, and there was lorries, miles and miles of lorries parked up, waiting for permission from Israel to deliver that food aid. And that's what I mean when I say that this is an unnatural disaster. It's unnatural because it's deliberate. It's a man-made catastrophe in which people are not starving, people are being starved. And the Prime Minister recognised that in September, when he said the Israeli government are preventing urgently needed aid from getting in, which is why we are now seeing a man-made famine. Yet despite recognising that the Israeli government is responsible for creating that man-made famine by using food as a weapon of war, that same Prime Minister and his government steadfastly refused to do anything other than impose performative sanctions against a couple of individual ministers, while continuing to provide the military and political support the Netanyahu regime needs to continue doing what it wants. And that is why the people of the United Kingdom have, over the past 2 years, come together to support the civilian population the way they have. By signing this petition, in every corner of the UK, including the great folk of Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber, the people are demanding that the UK government does so much more to hold Israel to account for its actions, to force Israel to lift the siege, to assist the United Nations flood Gaza with whatever assistance it requires to end the appalling suffering. And I sincerely thank them, commend them and applaud them for their efforts.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr McVeigh. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon, and I do thank all of the petitioners for their efforts, as well as my constituents who, like the member before me highlighted, have for decades been campaigning and standing with the people of Gaza and across the occupied territories of Palestine. The critical humanitarian situation in Gaza must remain the focus of this government. The demand for medical and surgical facilities, for equipment, for clinical staff and interventions are as demanding as ever, and the consequences of famine and war, alongside the more recent surges in violence after the so-called ceasefire, which continues to require an acute response, needs to be measured alongside that chronic management of disease, of poor sanitation, malnutrition, and, as we've heard earlier, especially healthcare for women, often incredibly frail, and for children as well. Maternity provision for women when 130 babies are born every day into this horrendous situation, a fifth prematurely or enduring complications, and of course that forever call for good public health. I'm happy to give way.
UNICEF have highlighted that the Israeli blockade is preventing nearly 1 million bottles of ready-to-use infant formula reaching babies in Gaza at risk of malnutrition. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we must impose widespread economic sanctions on Israel unless and until that aid is let through?
I thank my honourable friend. It's an obscenity, the fact that mothers cannot feed their infants and only have filthy, disease-ridden water in which to give to their children. And of course, we have got to use every lever we have to address that injustice, including the sanctions on the government, which we've heard already in this debate, as we've applied to other nations, we must to the Israeli government too. In the light of the makeshift hospitals being ready to erect, sitting the other side of the border, it's absolutely vital that there's negotiations to bring them across the border so that such facilities can be erected rapidly and, of course, filled with the support that is needed, whether it's equipment, pharmaceuticals, and, of course, crucially, the medical staff. I understand that the number of health service points has risen from 197 in October to 219 today, but against such need, the levels of staffing and equipment needs to be matched. With so much reconstruction needed for medical facilities too, can the Minister say how the UK Government is ensuring that assessment of sites is undertaken so construction can be prioritised around healthcare? Likewise, with workforce, what are the health needs for the workforce to be taken into Gaza? How can we support that effort in a transitional period and, of course, in the long term? Likewise, with equipment required and, of course, pharmaceuticals as well, so that we can help support the supply that is required at this time. We've already heard about anaesthetics not being in place and operations taking place without such. We cannot imagine the suffering which people continue to have as a result. It is urgent, and we need to be able to address those health concerns. And as we witness in wars across the world, it is women and girls who are targeted. Sexual violence has further wounded its survivors, and we should further support services to provide them with the services alongside rigorous safeguarding to ensure that children at this time are protected from those who tragically may prey on them. What has the Minister done to raise this specific issue with the Israeli authorities and to ensure children are safeguarded? Regarding the workforce for health, are we confident that medics and other health professionals taken captive by the IDF have all been released? If not, what is the Minister doing to press that point? Their skills are needed, and it is important that they are given safe passage back into Gaza to support their community. Happy to give way.
Many thanks. Does she agree with me that also journalists must be given free access to Gaza and that it's very important that international reporting resumes immediately?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Of course, journalists are the eyes of the world, and they open all of our eyes to the suffering and the scale of what is happening, and we need to ensure the safety and security of journalists as well as the free access which my honourable friend calls for. I also understand that 16,500 people are currently registered for medical evacuation, with many more yet to make the list. These long lists are posing serious risk to life. The UK, as I understand, has evacuated 51 children plus family members for medical treatment. How will this government ensure that life-saving interventions, which are overwhelming, are addressed in proportion by our country? We can do more and we must do more. MSF rightly highlights that priority should be given not just on age but also medical emergency. Are we ensuring that these patients are properly triaged and we are taking those most in need to provide that support? I also believe that we could do a lot more to scale in the region, and I trust that the Minister can set out exactly what's happening around healthcare so that people can just cross the border and receive the healthcare they need. As well, of course, as we've heard, the aid needs to flow. It cannot be impeded any longer at the border, whatever that requirement is. Beyond this, I would also like the government to consider how we can assist in the training of medical and other health professionals from Gaza. Our medical, nursing and AHP schools are first class. With all the universities in Gaza decimated, there is a clear need to ensure that the Palestinian healthcare workers of the future are given the right training and opportunity, alongside those who are currently practicing, to have remote supervision and interventions that could support. So how further can we help support those programmes? Also, are we doing everything we can to ensure vaccination programmes are in place, not least with the significant risk of disease? And then finally, if I can turn to the issue of trauma, which is unimaginable and enduring, we need to ensure Palestine has the opportunity to heal, the mental health support that many of us talk about here in our country, but we cannot imagine the scale that is needed in Gaza. What support are we giving to ensure that the right mental health support is given to heal that nation? When we used to see injustices across international borders and the world order wasn't working, we used to call the world together to ensure that we changed the world order and ensure that justice was served. It seems to this date we follow the rules and don't set the rules anymore. And I ask the Minister to really dig deep at this time to say what more can we really do to ensure that we are that convening voice once again to change that world order and ensure that justice is served and people have the need, the aid and resources they need to move forward from this tragedy which will mark us all in years to come.
Shockat Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Bay. It's a real honour to serve under your chairship today, and I'd like to thank all the individuals that signed the petition. I want to solely concentrate today, because so much has already been said, is on the casualties of this horrendous conflict, and in particular children. We've all heard powerful testimonies today, we've all seen the images on our screens, but we must never forget that these numbers are just numbers, but behind each and every number there's a child, there's a human being, there's somebody's flesh and blood, and in the word of a Palestinian grandfather, the soul of my soul, who he buried. Save the Children recently highlighted that in 2024, an average of 475 Palestinian children suffered lifelong disabilities. We've heard of over 30,000 potential children killed and over 1,000 people murdered in the West Bank, of which 270 were children. These children have passed on I want to concentrate on the ones that have been left behind. And many, every month, because of the war, have traumatic brain injuries, burns, and in fact Gaza has become home to the largest cohort of children amputees in modern day history. So the question is, what can we do about this? On private donations, Project Pure Hope has managed to evacuate a grand total of 3 children so far for urgent treatment in the UK, whilst 10 children were brought over by the UK government for urgent care. We have brought refugees in this country before. We have brought over 200,000 Ukrainians here, rightfully so. I am sure we can find the heart and the means and the ways to bring our Palestinian children here if we really wanted to. And on a personal constituent note, I have been contacted by a constituent of mine, in fact a constituent that we managed to bring over along with Leicester University as a postgraduate student from Gaza. Sadly, she contacted me 3 weeks ago now, I think, where her family home was bombed, where she lost by the Israelis and her brother was killed. But sadly, along with her brother, her niece, Noor, her name is Noor Ibrahim, and her sister-in-law, Ronza Mohammed, are badly injured. But it's little things, even shrapnel in their legs. There's no antibiotics, so they're getting sepsis. And I've spoken to the minister, I've written to the minister about this particular case, and I know the minister would, if he could, help in any capacity to get these children over, but I'm pleading with him to see what his department can do to bring this family over to safety. And finally, I just want the UK government to commit to 2 practical steps. First is to advocate for and help deliver safe, protected medical evacuation routes for children and other vulnerable civilians. And secondly, to establish a clear, compassionate commitment to receive a defined number of the most critical medical cases here in the UK, particularly where the individuals have close family already here. We can't overturn what has happened, but at least we can stop this tragedy from becoming even worse for those that have survived. Thank you.
Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairing. And I thank my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire and Arran, for opening this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. Gaza's healthcare system has been severely depleted. Israel's campaign has destroyed health facilities, killed health workers, and restricted vital medical supplies. As has been mentioned, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory reported in September that Israel's actions, including the systematic destruction of the health system, amount to genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Although the recent ceasefire has allowed a greater flow of aid, such as vital health supplies, more must be done to ensure the level of supply meets the scale of need. And as winter approaches, as others have said, the health needs of Gaza remain dire. Israeli authorities continue to impede full humanitarian access. Humanitarian access is a legal obligation under international law, not a concession of any ceasefire. I will give way.
Thank you. Given that the ICJ ruled last year that there is a plausible case of genocides in Gaza, and given that the humanitarian situation has drastically deteriorated since then, does my honourable friend agree that the UK must actively support efforts to ensure that every rejection of aid, every refusal of trucks in for spurious reasons is ultimately documented so that it can be put before the ICJ in the South Africa case to hold Israel accountable in international law for breach of IHL?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I do agree it is absolutely vital that we have the proper documentation of what is happening, in order that we can hold people to account for what has happened. And that's why, in terms of also the point was made earlier about the need for journalists to have access, so that people can see and can report on what is happening in order that people can be held to account.
On that point,
I will give way.
Thank my friend for giving way. Does he agree that in addition to those who've
plausibly found to have endorsed or committed acts of violence against journalists, those who have endorsed or committed acts of violence against aid workers and health workers, that there needs to be urgent work, as my old friends just said, to record all those crimes and ensure that there is ultimately a reckoning and that there is justice for all those who have endorsed crimes against humanity.
I thank my own friend for his intervention, and I do agree that we do need to make sure that although we have a ceasefire, a very fragile ceasefire, and even if that ceasefire is successful, we need to ensure that what has gone before is held, people are held to account for what has happened. We shouldn't allow progress now with a ceasefire to take away from there is accountability for past actions. I will give way.
I recognise what the member says in terms of past actions, but blocking food is also a war crime. Does the member agree?
Thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I do agree that in terms of it is not just what's gone on in the past. I was referring there to past actions, but also people need to be able to account for what is happening now. And as I've said, the withholding of humanitarian aid is in itself an act in breach of humanitarian law and international law, and those responsible for it need to be held to account. I will give way.
I thank the member for giving way. Israel recently voted to deny access to UNRWA, the primary aid agency with the deepest operational footprint in Gaza. This is a move to end humanitarian relief for Gaza. The ICJ ruled on the 22nd of October last month in its advisory opinion that Israel's allegations that UNRWA lacks impartiality is not only unfounded, but Israel's obstruction of the agency's outreach work is also at odds with international law. Would my friend agree with me that we, as the United Kingdom, must now shift to acts of consequences and activate every available alternative with or without Israel's support?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I would agree with him about the importance of UNRWA in ensuring the coordination and delivery of humanitarian aid. And their access must be unfettered, and they must be allowed in and allowed to do the work that needs to be done on the ground. Last week, the UN reported that more than 13,000 households across Gaza were affected by heavy rain and severe flooding, with sanitation systems having collapsed as a result of intense bombardment and siege. Rainwater no longer drains properly and now mixed with sewage that has flooded people's tents. Save the Children staff report seeing children sleeping on bare ground with no shelter, in clothes sodden with sewage water. The already high risk from preventable disease is growing. Health workers on the ground continue to see sustained rates of malnutrition, diarrhoea and pneumonia. Such conditions and ailments are entirely avoidable in the modern world. Responsibility for these awful conditions lies with the restrictions and delays imposed by Israeli authorities. Therefore, the UK must prioritise humanitarian access in all our diplomatic engagement on the future of Gaza. I will give way.
Chair, and I thank the honourable friend for giving way. We know, and we've heard this afternoon and evening, how Palestinian children have paid the heaviest price in this devastating conflict, with so many children in Gaza City and the surrounding areas severely malnourished. Does my honourable friend agree that Israel and the international community must do whatever it can to make sure aid is allowed without obstruction to those areas where it's needed the most, vitally for the children affected?
Thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I do agree that there is a huge priority in getting that humanitarian aid in, and it is absolutely upon the international community, including ourselves, to do all that we can to ensure that flow of aid. To ensure that children and families have sustained access to aid and the services need to recover and rebuild their lives, Gaza's healthcare system must be restored. For this to happen, there must be a removal of all remaining restrictions and bureaucratic impediments to the entry of aid, especially food, water, fuel, medical supplies and other critical humanitarian items. Therefore, I hope the Minister in his response will confirm that as part of the UK's involvement in the Civil Military Coordination Centre, tasked with coordinating humanitarian aid and recovery in Gaza, he has set the critical and achievable objective, ensuring that British aid charities such as Medical Aid for Palestinians and Oxfam can operate freely and without restriction in Gaza, including unhindered entry for staff, medical teams and vital humanitarian supplies. Many questions remain regarding the scale of continued suffering in Gaza. Why is it the case that UNICEF had at least 938,000 bottles of infant formula released only recently, after being stuck at the border since August? How can a life-saving vaccination campaign by UNICEF succeed when 1.6 million syringes and other vital supplies have been kept outside Gaza for months, blocked from entering despite their urgent necessity? And why is it the case that since the 11th of October, according to UNICEF, at least 58 children have been killed in conflict-related incidents? The UK must redouble efforts to pressure Israeli authorities to maintain the ceasefire and allow UN-backed professional humanitarian agencies to reach people in need at scale with meaningful assistance. Only then will Gaza be able to rebuild its homes, its health and its future. A viable Palestinian state is required if we're to see a two-state solution. I look forward to hearing the Minister's response to the debate.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. The E-petition is focused on our humanitarian obligations in Gaza. Over 600 people from my constituency of Dewsbury and Batley signed the petition, along with over 200,000 across our nation. And one ask, which my honourable friend mentioned in her opening remarks, was there is an immediate need for delivery of aid with or without Israeli support. This is the key point. Since the ceasefire began, the situation has remained deeply unstable and deadly. And in my mind, the only positive that has come from this ceasefire has been the release of the hostages living and the return of the remains of those that were killed. Apart from that positive, Israel has continued its relentless attack and murder and starvation of women, children and men with impunity. Israel, since the ceasefire on October the 10th, there's an estimated 497 Israeli violations that have been documented in the last 44 days. Around 342 Palestinians have been slaughtered and nearly 875 injured, most of them women, children and elderly. The violations include 140 incidents of direct gunfire at civilians and homes, 220 plus bombardments by air, land and artillery, 21 ground incursions beyond the agreed yellow line, and 100 demolitions of homes and civilian structures, the very few that were remaining. And the continued blockade of aid being used as, blockade of humanitarian aid being used as a weapon of genocide. The need for aid pre this current conflict, before October the 7th, just for basic needs to be met, was 500 trucks per day going into Gaza. These were majority distributed by UNRWA across Gaza for decades, for many, many years. Throughout 2024 and early 2025, an average of between 36, only 36 and 100 trucks a day of aid have entered Gaza. I will give way.
Thank you, Member, for giving way. Would you agree with me that it is now, with immediate urgency, that this government needs to work with international partners to deliver the aid that is required through a military-led humanitarian corridor, so that no aid can be blocked by Israel?
thank my honourable friend for his intervention. We must do whatever it takes to get aid into Gaza to stop the people dying of starvation, to get medical aid to stop people dying from treatable illnesses and injuries. And this government and all its allies must work together to not just remove and get aid into Gaza, but any involvement of Israel in Gaza must be immediately removed. They must not have any part to play in this peace plan. They are the perpetrators of a genocide. How can they be allowed to participate in the distribution or the implementation of a peace plan that will save lives in Gaza? So what the peace plan said was that a minimum of 600 trucks a day would be allowed into Gaza to support the over 2 million people for their basic needs. However, much more than that is needed as a result of the complete annihilation of Gaza, its infrastructure, and its medical facilities. Malnutrition exceeds 90%, and the IPC Level 5 famine classification was reached in July of this year. The UN says that the current pace it would take, at the current pace of less than 100 trucks a day, it would take 6 months just to deliver the pre-positioned aid that's at the borders. UNRWA estimates that, on average, there has been a maximum of 150 to 170 trucks a day of aid. So the ceasefire has done little to stabilise access to essential services. We've heard the Gaza health system remains on the brink. Hospitals and clinics continue to be understaffed, undersupplied and under threat. UNICEF and other agencies warn that the collapse of medical infrastructure means even treatable illnesses can become life or limb threatening. People continue to starve as aid is held up by the government. The pattern we are seeing is stark. Even with a supposed truce, children are being killed, people are being wounded, and violations continue with impunity. I've said in the chamber, and I will repeat again, Israel does not want peace. It doesn't want the Palestinians to have their state, and its plan of complete extermination of the Palestinian people is continuing to be enacted before our very eyes. Over 2 years, 26th month that we're in now. We must act now to get Israel out of Gaza and get all the aid that's waiting at the borders in, and to provide all the supplies to start rebuilding not just the buildings in Gaza, but people's lives. So the violation of international humanitarian law continues unabated. The ceasefire was never cured, but it was an opportunity for real, sustained protection of civilian life from Israeli bombardment. So we must demand that Israel adheres to the pause in hostilities, not just in name, but in practice. Aid must be allowed immediate, unfettered, and to deliver food, water, medicine, and critical services. So our moral responsibility demands more than words. I am so sorry to say this, but since I became an MP and I've been in Parliament, I haven't seen a concrete step by our government that I believe has saved lives. The millions of pounds in aid that has been allocated to helping Gazans has been sat at the borders. Our supply of weapons, parts for F-35, has continued. The amount of weapons that were sold to Israel since this government came to power is 4 times as much as over the last 3 years of the previous government. So all these complicity and our active participation in these atrocities must stop, and the government, please, must act immediately to get aid in. Thank you very much.
Lizzie Collins.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to sit here today under your chairship. Ms McVeigh, Gaza is in ruins. Almost everything needed to sustain life, homes, businesses, farmlands, have been reduced to rubble. The international responsibility is clear: provide aid, restore essential services, and help Palestinians reclaim control over their future. Because for peace to last, we can't just focus on the absence of violence. We also need to rebuild the foundations of long-term stability. Gaza's people need long-term support and the opportunity to rebuild their lives, even when global attention has shifted. This means enabling Palestinians to play a central role in rebuilding their lives and institutions, because reconstruction must include both physical infrastructure, but also civic systems, ensuring that Palestinians can govern themselves freely. And of course, the Israeli government must abandon the stranglehold they have on Palestinian aid. Despite their pledge to allowing humanitarian relief, they are still blocking desperately needed supplies. Aid must reach Gaza alongside restoring critical infrastructure like electricity, water treatment and public services. Only then can the larger task of reconstruction move forward. And as I've said, I'll happily give way.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Does the member agree that it should be the Palestinians who determine how Gaza should be reconstructed, and that a Palestinian body should be selected, and they should select which companies get which contracts, and all the reconstruction contracts should be properly accounted for and delivered to a proper standard?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I absolutely agree that Palestinians must be in the driving seat. This can't be a solution that is imposed upon them, and Palestinians know best what is right for them and their country, and that absolutely has to be central. And of course, any monies that go in have to be properly accounted for, and any reconstruction done properly. And as I've said, civic infrastructure is key to this. It's absolutely right that Hamas play no role in the governing of Palestine going forwards. They're an horrific organisation. Their extreme ideology and violent actions have caused immense harm both within and without Palestinian borders. They can't be allowed to control Gaza's future. But history offers crucial lessons as to how to shape post-war civic society. For example, in the wake of the Iraq War, the restoration of essential services was strained by the absence of administrative and management personnel. The de-Baathification of the Iraq government decimated the state bureaucracy and hollowed out civic infrastructure. Any holder of a Ba'ath Party card was dismissed. This included teachers, low-level functionaries who needed the card to work. I'll happily give way.
There are over 10,000 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, many of whom are part of civil society, are part of an opposition. One of them, Marwan Barghouti, has been in Israeli prison for 23 years, 7 months and 8 days, has now been threatened with execution by Ben Gvir. Isn't it time that we release some of these people who could reinvigorate both the Palestinian political scene and civil society?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I absolutely agree that Israel must release prisoners, particularly those who are there for their actions, their non-violent actions against the occupation, and we will need, the Palestinians will need all talents there, and the Israeli government must take action on that. I was speaking, Madam Chair, about the aftermath of the war in Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. Now, obviously, the situation in Gaza is not a carbon copy of what happened there. This is simply of an example where thoughtless implementation of a reasonable headline policy had an impact which went far beyond the stated intent and created, I'll happily give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Well, she's making a very interesting speech. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, there was, as she quite rightly says, a sort of de-Baathification policy, which had the effect of destroying all public services, allowing anyone to get weapons from the now dysfunctional army, and it set off a whole chain of the most ghastly civil and local conflicts, and that is a real danger. You have to maintain it. And in Gaza now, despite everything, there is still some degree of functionality on the local government operations who are actually attempting to make plans for the rebuilding of their towns and villages all across Gaza. Surely we should be a little less judgmental of them and supportive of them in trying to make a start on reconstruction.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. I absolutely agree that we need to use the people who are on the ground who know the area best in rebuilding. And I think the international community would be foolish not to look at previous post-war measures in other conflicts and learn the right lessons, because the people of Gaza can't afford for preventable mistakes to be repeated. And with an economy in ruins and a population traumatised by years of conflict, Palestinians do need international help to rebuild. But it is Palestinians themselves. I'll happily give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's being very generous with her time and interventions. As has been said this afternoon, the ceasefire is hugely welcome, but on its own it doesn't restock a hospital, rebuild a home or feed a hungry child. So does she agree with me that the UK's recognition of the State of Palestine is a crucial step in supporting the Palestinian people to rebuild their own country?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I absolutely agree that our recognition of a Palestinian state earlier this year is absolutely crucial to ensuring that Palestinians can rebuild fully, because as he said, it's not simply the stopping of violence that counts, it is all of the next steps, and efforts must be led by Palestinians across the whole of society, and I would say particularly that women need to be actively included throughout Reconstruction, guiding it throughout, and not simply as an afterthought. This window of time could not be more important. Recent history should remind us that what is meant to be temporary can often become entrenched. Israel's occupation of the West Bank has lasted 50 years. I'll happily give way.
I can commend the honourable ladies making a very important contribution, and this is looking then to the medium to long term. But candidly, if we're going to have any civic infrastructure in Gaza, then the seeds of that must come from the West Bank. And it's in the West Bank that we see it under threat day and daily. So while she's right, the international focus has to be on Gaza, we can't ignore the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank are undergoing a horrific programme of seeing settler oppression, settler violence and settler expansion, which threatens both Gaza and the West Bank.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and he is absolutely right. Whilst the international focus has been on Gaza, horrific acts still continue to be enacted in the West Bank, and the people there living in fear of settler violence, and that's why I've very much welcomed sanctions upon some settler organisations, although I think we could have gone further. He makes a very good point, and for Palestine to live freely, we have to talk about the whole of Palestine. It cannot be divided, it cannot be carved up piecemeal, and the illegal occupations absolutely must stop now. Too many Palestinians fear that the destruction, displacement and suffering they have endured will become permanent. We can't let that happen. So much has been lost and so many lives destroyed. But those who survive need urgent aid and the chance to rebuild. And our responsibility is to ensure that the people of Gaza emerge from this horror with the tools, support and autonomy to shape their own future. Thank you, Ms McVeigh.
Smith.
The chair this evening, and it's a pleasure to speak in this petitions debate. I want to begin by congratulating my honourable friend for North Ayrshire and Arran in her opening of today's debate. As a former chair of the Petitions Committee, I know that the E-petition system engages so many of our constituents and gives us the opportunity to talk about the issues that matter for them. And with nearly 200,000 people having signed this E-petition, it's very clear that is a very good example of the Petitions Committee acting at its best and giving us the opportunity to talk about the things that matter to our constituents. The petition was signed by 278 of my constituents, but I know that I've had contact from well over 1,000 of my constituents in the last 2 years on this issue, which says to me that this is an issue which engages and energises and impassions my constituents, because they see on their TV screens the suffering in Gaza and they want us as parliamentarians to do something about that. And I want to put on record my thanks to so many of my constituents who not just contact me as their Member of Parliament about this issue, but regularly go out and fundraise. I know that my constituents have raised money for various humanitarian charities with fundraising activities, music concerts and regular collections right across Lancaster and Wyre, and many of them will be following this evening's debate. In fact, I was inspired by so many of them and also by the scenes and accounts that we get from aid workers on the ground in Gaza that in October this year I signed up to run the Great Scottish Run and raised £5,174 for medical aid for Palestinians. And thank you. Shortly after completing that run, and I put on record my declaration of members' interest here, I had the opportunity with the APPG for Christianity in the Holy Land, for which I'm the Vice Chair, of going and visiting the Holy Land and meeting with Christian organisations. And I will keep my remarks short because I broadly agree with so much of what's already been said in this debate regarding access to humanitarian aid. And I want to talk specifically about something which has not been touched on as much yet in this debate, which is the way in which the Christian community in Gaza has been impacted by the events. The Holy Family Church in Gaza was struck in July this year. It killed 3 people who were sheltering there and injured 10 more. And following that attack, Patriarch Theophilus III and Cardinal Pizzaballa visited the churches in solidarity with their communities on the ground. And on the APPG delegation visit earlier this autumn, we had the opportunity to meet with church leaders and hear about we managed to meet with church leaders in Jerusalem, but heard from them about the relationships that they are trying to maintain with the Christian churches in Gaza and how that is so challenging because of the ongoing war. And all 3 Christian sites, the Holy Family Church, St. Porphyrius and the Al-Halil Hospital, have been damaged multiple times since the start of the year. And we know that there are still around 600 Christians continuing to shelter within the 2 churches. And whilst there has been a small uptick in the humanitarian support since the ceasefire came into effect in October this year, that is still a small uptick, and the community is continuing to suffer to have difficulty in accessing the absolute basics, which colleagues have already touched on in this debate. So just very briefly, I wanted to call upon the Minister and the Government to hold relevant actors to account to ensure that the currently reached ceasefire is bolstered, supported and maintained, and an adequate flow of aid gets through, reaching local people in Gaza. But also to implore all parties to explore the opportunities to offer economic support for rebuilding church-run hospitals, schools and charities, and access for the heads of churches to Gaza. As I mentioned earlier, that's not always been an easy thing for the heads of churches to be able to do. And to ensure that all governments constructively engage with the churches as a partner in the interfaith dialogue which has been put forward in point 18 of Trump's peace plan. Because the Christian community, although a minority community, still has an important and significant role in the ongoing and long-standing peace in the region. And finally, I just want to ask the Minister what pressure he's putting on Israel to allow journalists into Gaza, because without journalists on the ground in Gaza, it's very difficult to know the full extent of what's going on. And they are, of course, the eyes of the world, and we need to be able to have that free, unimpeded journalist reports about what's going on in Gaza. So with that, I draw my remarks to a close and thank all those who have signed the E-petition and given us the opportunity to put on record our concerns about the situation in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. And I thank my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire and Arran, for opening this important debate today. I'd also like to thank the 1,351 residents of Dulwich and West Norwood constituency for signing the petition, a number which speaks to the extent of distress and concern that my constituents feel about the situation in Gaza. The ceasefire, which began on the 10th of October, is very welcome, enabling the remaining hostages to be released and the bodies of deceased hostages to be returned, alongside the release of Palestinian detainees and allowing Palestinians to return home. But it is impossible to overstate how much devastation the people of Gaza have suffered over the past 2 years and how much they continue to suffer. Almost everyone has been displaced, often multiple times. Loved ones have been killed. The people have faced starvation, a famine across Gaza, the risk of disease and the decimation of the healthcare system. Now they are returning home and finding only piles of rubble on the streets where they once lived. There is an urgent need for humanitarian aid at scale to reach Gaza, now and every week and every month for the foreseeable future. There is an urgent need for food, for medicine, for shelters and blankets as we enter the winter months, for the restoration of infrastructure, water supplies, communications, schools and healthcare facilities. This situation is not the result of a natural disaster, and nor was it unavoidable. It is the result of the relentless bombardment of civilians, of schools and hospitals, of roads and infrastructure, the restriction by the Israeli government for 2 years of humanitarian aid into Gaza at anything close to the scale that was needed, the forced displacement of people from their homes and their land. So as we speak of reconstruction and humanitarian obligations, we must also speak of the need for justice and accountability under international law. The need to drive forward the humanitarian response and reconstruction is urgent, but that urgency cannot mean that the question of accountability for the many breaches of international humanitarian law by the Israeli government and Hamas in Gaza and by the Israeli government in the West Bank over the past 2 years is forgotten. So I want to ask the Minister if he can update the House on the UK government's approach to justice and accountability in relation to the conflict in Gaza, what engagement he has had with the US, the UN and other partners on this issue, and how confident he can be that under the current plans the question of accountability is not being dismissed. It is also important that legal obligations are the starting point for the situation in Gaza going forward. The ICJ has determined in an advisory opinion in October 2025 that Israel, as an occupying power, has a general obligation to administer the territory for the benefit of the local population. It is really important that the failure to discharge this obligation does not become normalised. So I want to turn my attention now to the current humanitarian crisis.
I thank the member for giving way. Does the member agree with me that aid should not be at the behest or the permission of the Israeli government, and that international community should come together to make sure that is not the case?
I agree with my honourable friend that we need unfettered access for aid into Gaza. I want to turn my attention now to the current humanitarian crisis. The ceasefire has restored the distribution of aid to the UN, who are best placed to undertake this complex task and who should never have been forced to stop operating in this role. But the situation remains desperate and there is still not unimpeded access. For example, there is a significant problem with tents for basic shelter being able to get into Gaza due to Israeli government restrictions. Winter is fast approaching and there has been flooding in parts of Gaza. Tents are urgently needed for basic shelter. There is also an urgent need to restore the healthcare system to provide services to a population whose health is fragile in so many ways, and a particular need for healthcare services for women, because approximately 130 babies are being born every day in Gaza in conditions of acute risk.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. And we're all agreed on the need to get aid urgently into Gaza now. But research from famine in World War II shows the lasting impact, even on unborn fetuses from famine, which cannot later be erased or reversed. And famine can also lead to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So would she agree with me that Israel must allow unrestricted passage of aid, not just to mitigate the devastation that we're seeing now, but also to prevent severe consequences that will stretch long into the future?
I thank the honourable member for her intervention. I agree with everything that she's said. It is vitally important that the aid that is so badly needed in Gaza is allowed to enter Gaza unrestricted, and that we recognise that that process will need to continue for the foreseeable future, because the situation is so desperate now and the recovery will be long. The recovery cannot begin without that unfettered access. There are currently only 15 health facilities in Gaza able to provide maternity and obstetric care, and mothers are giving birth without anaesthesia or essential drugs. Alongside the healthcare system in Gaza, the education system has also been largely destroyed. Children in Gaza have been traumatised by the conflict, and their psychosocial recovery is a really important part of achieving long-term peace and stability. They also have a right to education. Children in Gaza are desperate to return to school, and the UN is working hard to restore education services. But the current ceasefire agreement and 20-point plan are silent on the subject of education, and this is allowing it to be deprioritised. The Israeli government's coordinator of government activities in the territories, COGAT, is stating that all school supplies are currently banned from entry to Gaza. UNRWA has submitted self-learning materials to COGAT for approval in July 2024. They acknowledge that the question of textbooks and content is controversial, but those supplies have not been approved, and all basic materials, including basic stationery supplies, are currently being denied.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she agree with me that Israel should not be the one deciding what aid gets in and and is allowed into Gaza, having been the perpetrator of the genocide?
I thank the member for his intervention, and as I said, I agree that aid should be unfettered into Gaza. It should be administered by the UN and aid agencies who are well able to determine with Palestinians what is needed in terms of supplies. But I want to ask the Minister if he will agree with me that it is unacceptable to deny the children of Gaza their right to education, and that it is vitally important that a way forward is found for education materials to be allowed into Gaza, along with psychosocial kit replacement supplies, so that children can begin the long process of recovery. Over the last 2 years, we have witnessed the destruction of the entire education system in Gaza. 97% of all schools have sustained some level of damage. And this is happening not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. I have myself stood in the ruins of 2 schools destroyed by violent settlers in the West Bank. These are attacks perpetrated by a member state of the UN that has not yet signed the Safe Schools Declaration, which has been signed by both the UK and the Palestinian Authority. Today, we are on the eve of the 5th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration, taking place in Nairobi tomorrow, marking 10 years since its inception. So I call on the Minister to exert pressure on the Israeli government to join the declaration and to commit to refrain from causing further damage to education facilities in Gaza and the West Bank. This recovery is a long road, and the ceasefire is fragile. The coming together of different parties to protect education, to respect the rights of children, and to ensure that unfettered access for all of the supplies that are needed to sustain that recovery is where that process must start.
Thank you. Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much. I just serve under your chairship, and I thank the honourable member for North Ayrshire and Aaron for leading this debate, and the people who signed the petition, of which there are 285 from Norwich North. It's a very important and timely debate, as many members have said, because while there may now be a ceasefire in place, a devastating humanitarian situation continues in Gaza. And while I welcome the ceasefire and the release of the hostages, there is a long, long way to go to ensure that that peace is sustainable and the unimaginable human suffering ends. As we have heard, Israeli authorities continue to restrict humanitarian supplies into Gaza, leading to a devastating shortage of food, medicine and life-saving supplies. UN agencies have warned that the food assistance is still below what we need and call for more to be let in. This comes, of course, after years of conflict and a human toll that is unimaginable for many of us. Many members have touched on it, but I want to focus my remarks today on the impact on women and girls. This is particularly timely given that tomorrow is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, and this year marks 25 years since the agreement of the landmark resolution, UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Yet 25 years on, we are failing women and girls, not only in Gaza, but in Sudan, Ukraine, the DRC and many, many other places. And we should also recognise the devastating impact on women of the October 7th attacks, with many horrific reports. There must be accountability and no impunity for violence against women and girls wherever it is found. But let me turn to Gaza. The crisis has had a devastating impact on all civilians, as we have heard, but women and girls have been disproportionately and uniquely affected in many ways. They make up 67% of the estimated 60,000 Palestinians killed. Health services have basically collapsed, meaning women struggle to access sexual and reproductive health services, and, as we have heard, this has a catastrophic impact on pregnant women. The UN estimates that 55,000 pregnant women have nowhere to seek medical help. Approximately 130 babies are born every day in conditions of acute risk, and 1 in 5 are born prematurely or suffering from complications. Imagine what should be one of the happiest times of your life, and all you can do is hope and pray for the future of your baby, with no guarantee of good health care or essential medicines.
There are stories of mothers giving birth without anaesthesia or essential drugs, and reports of rising maternal and newborn deaths. And as the weather changes, this will get even worse. And we know that the blockade has also produced human-made famine conditions in parts of Gaza, with catastrophic consequences for pregnant and breastfeeding women and for young children. Because we know, and the evidence shows from around the world, that women and girls eat last and least in conflict. And in conflict, violence and sexual violence surges, yet support services and legal services collapse. The chance of justice is barely even a glimmer. So the situation is dire, but despite this, we must not see women and girls as only victims. They are also first responders and leaders. As ActionAid has rightly highlighted, Palestinian women and women's rights organisations continue to lead humanitarian response and community support, providing vital services. Yet their work is far too often under-resourced and under-recognised. So that leads me on to what the UK and other governments can and must do. Firstly, diplomacy must, of course, remain a top priority, working to ensure the unfettered access for humanitarian aid and upholding our obligations under international law. As a former member of the International Development Select Committee, I think the member referenced the report earlier this year, which said that we must lead when it comes to international humanitarian law, because there is a gap in a nation-state leading on that, and the UK has the chance to do that. Secondly, we must prioritise long-term funding for humanitarian aid and ensure a significant proportion of the aid we are delivering goes to women's rights organisations. And I would ask the Minister if he can respond specifically to that point in his response. How are we tracking where our aid is going and whether it is reaching those grassroots women's organisations on the front line? And I want to also emphasise, and I'm currently the chair of the UN All-Party Parliamentary Group, the important work of UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, who do vital work providing healthcare and safe spaces for women and girls. They are suffering from reductions in foreign aid from many countries, particularly the US, who is turning away from them. So I hope the UK makes as we make difficult decisions about where our aid goes, we will continue to speak up and support its vital work. And we have heard about the importance of UNRWA, which is no traditional aid agency. As we have heard from many different people around the world, it effectively provides many of the functions akin to local government in this country, and it is vital to getting aid to people on the ground. And can I also welcome the fact that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has paused, I believe, its work on the ground, because the way it was delivering aid goes against all humanitarian principles, and I hope that will remain the case, that it ceases to operate. And then thirdly, in line with UN Resolution 1325, women must be meaningfully involved in the peacebuilding processes and post-war recovery. The evidence is clear, peace processes last longer when women are involved, and we have seen that in other contexts, such as in Liberia. So it's not only the right thing to do to ensure women are at the table and they have a voice, but that it is in all our interests too. Lastly, it's welcome that the UK has a national action plan on women, peace and security, which was in fact drawn up under the last government. I believe that currently Palestine is not a focused country of that, so I'd ask the government to consider adding it and working to ensure Palestinian women and girls receive the same protections as women in other conflict contexts. There are many other areas I could have spoken about in this debate, and many members have touched on them, but this, the impact on women and girls, is one we must not ignore, and which sadly is too often not spoken about. I know that upholding the rights of women and girls is something the Foreign Secretary is strongly committed to, and has indeed published a piece today expressing the UK's commitment to tackling particularly violence against women and girls. So I look forward to the Minister setting out how we will work to stand with women and girls in Gaza and beyond. The ceasefire is an important step forward, but it must lead to real change, to a two-state solution and a just and lasting peace for Palestinians, Israelis and the whole region. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Wall.
Thank you, Ms Butler. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. And can I start by thanking my honourable friend for North Ayrshire and Arran and others for setting out the context of this modern-day moral outrage that is the plight of the people of Gaza. Gaza may have disappeared from the headlines and from the TV screens, but the suffering for many continues. And neither I nor my constituents in Rochdale will allow the Palestinian people to be forgotten this winter or any winter. Yes, the ceasefire brokered by the United States and others was undeniably welcome. Finally, we're seeing the deceased and the living hostages returned, prisoners released, and the bombing has abated. But for more than 2 years, innocent Palestinians have endured the destruction of their homes, the tearing apart of their communities, and a relentless assault on their basic humanity and their dignity. And now, as the winter rains fall upon their battered land, the misery deepens. Camps have become swamps, as has been said. Families who once had roofs over their heads now huddle in mud and water, fetid water, some of it sewage water. More than 250,000 people are in desperate need of emergency tents and tarpaulins. The skies may be quieter, the airstrikes are fewer, but the silent killers of disease and deprivation stalk the land of Palestine. Can I ask the Minister directly, what is the United Kingdom government doing to ensure that this emergency shelter reaches Palestinians without delay? And also, how will the new Civil Military Coordination Centre be used to compel Israel to open the floodgates of aid that Gaza so desperately needs? The UN Relief and Works Agency, as many have said at UNRWA, has been clear. Gaza remains in a catastrophic state despite the ceasefire. Israel continues to block international staff, continues to choke the entry of aid. 6,000 food trucks, as has been said, stand idle at the crossings. 6,000 trucks that could feed hungry mouths, clothe children, bring medicine to the sick. 90% of Gaza's population now survives entirely on aid. Families scrape by on one meal a day. Just 170 trucks are still allowed in, far below the minimum required for basic survival. But as has been said, as well as the scandal of a lack of food, children of Gaza also suffer gravely from a lack of education. UNRWA struggles to provide schooling for 300,000 students remotely and 50,000 in person under intolerable conditions. 44,000 Palestinian children sit in makeshift learning spaces, often on cold floors without chairs. Their sense of security, their very childhood, is being eroded every single day. When I visited the West Bank earlier this year, one of the most shocking sights was seeing the ruins of a Palestinian school building that had been attacked by Israeli settlers in Zanuta. The trashed primary school desks, the maps ripped off the walls, the wrecked life chances will remain with me and many other parliamentarians who attended for a very long time, all with zero accountability for the perpetrators. Education does lie in ruins. Satellite imagery shows 93% of Gaza's schools directly hit or damaged. That's 526 out of 564 buildings destroyed or requiring reconstruction. In North Gaza and Rafah, every single school building has been hit. What kind of army bombs schools? Sure.
Thank the member for giving way on this important point, which he's making quite eloquently. Would he agree with me that the suffering of Palestinian people is not collateral, it is deliberate, and deliberate by Israeli government, and the UK must act because history is being recorded. We cannot sit and watch it being happen as it has been happening for the last 2 years now. We must act, and we must act immediately to stop the suffering of such terrible atrocities that we are being told.
I agree with my honourable friend. There must be accountability for Israel's actions and for its sins of omission as much as its sins of commission. What kind of army, as I say, bombs schools? So will the Minister say whether the UK is pushing for education to be a key part of the peace plan? Because as has been said already, that's singularly missing so far. Nearly 200,000 people signed the E-petition that brought us here today, one of the largest petitions of this Parliament, as has already been said. In Rochdale alone, 283 constituents added their names. This is not a fringe concern. It's a mainstream demand for justice. I will.
Grateful to the member for giving way. Can I add that 603 people from Blackburn also signed this petition, and every Friday my constituents are coming out in the cold or in the heat or in the rain, whatever the climate, they're coming out to remember the people of Gaza. May I remind this House, and may I remind the Minister and his government that this is the first live-streamed genocide of our time, and people will not forget this easily. They will continue to press us as their representatives and this government until this catastrophe comes to an end.
Thank him for those remarks. Yes, this is a grassroots, people-led campaign, as has been shown by the petition today. Now, there has been progress in November, expanded food rations, a catch-up immunisation campaign that vaccinated 13,000 children. High-performance tents have been distributed to learning spaces in Khan Yunis, at least. And bread prices are beginning to fall thanks to the World Food Programme. Households reporting 2 meals a day instead of 1. But that's not enough. Nowhere near enough. The challenges remain immense. Heavy rains have affected 13,000 households directly. Hundreds of tents have collapsed. Fuel shortages mean half the population still burns waste to cook. Infrastructure lies in ruins and aid convoys are always blocked at Rafah, where they shouldn't be. They're denied at Kerem Shalom. They're turned away at hospitals in the north. UNRWA has food parcels for 1.1 million people, flour for 2.1 million, shelter supplies for 1.3 million, all prepositioned outside Gaza. But Israel refuses to let them in. And so I say again, for too many Palestinians, this ceasefire is a fiction. Between the 12th of November and the 19th of November, the most recent data available, 8 Palestinians were killed, 41 injured, 18 bodies pulled from the rubble. Since 7th of October 2023, we all know the toll stands now at 69,513 dead, 170,745 injured. Even after the ceasefire, 280 people have been killed, 672 injured, 571 bodies retrieved. What kind of a ceasefire is this when the killing continues? Now, let's not forget that many ordinary Israelis want peace. Many Israeli human rights groups, civil society such as B'Tselem and others, are being targeted by Netanyahu's government. They know that without full rights for Palestinians and full statehood, there will never be genuine security for them or other Israelis. Madam Chair, this is not just a humanitarian crisis. It's a moral crisis. It's the test of our values as a nation, and we must have urgent action to open all the crossings, lift the restrictions and flood Gaza with aid at long last. And we must keep up progress for a two-state solution, with peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians side by side. But speaking of a two-state solution, it was particularly sickening this month to see the Israeli minister, as has been said, Ben-Gvir, taunting in prison the one man whom many Palestinians see as the Mandela of the Middle East, Marwan Barghouti. And I had the privilege of meeting his son when I was in Jerusalem earlier this year. Does the minister agree that Marwan Barghouti has a key role to play in the lasting peace for the region? The government has rightly recognised the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains desperate. And as the Middle East Minister himself has confirmed, in the financial year 25-26, the UK will provide more than £100 million for the occupied Palestinian territories, prioritising humanitarian relief, economic development and strengthening the Palestinian Authority. These are important commitments, but commitments must be matched by delivery. The people of Gaza cry out for shelter, for food, for education, for dignity. The petitioners cry out for action, and history will cry out for accountability. This Labour government has made an historic step in recognising the state of Palestine, something no other government has done in Britain before. We need similarly bold moves on aid too. Let's ensure that Britain is remembered for solidarity and political courage. Let's press Israel to open all those crossings, demand the entry of aid, support UNRWA in its vital work, and above all, work for a genuine ceasefire, one that stops the killing, one that allows rebuilding, one that restores hope of a two-state solution. Because without hope, Madam Chair, and without real justice, there can be no lasting peace in the Middle East.
Ryan Ishman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blackwood. It's a pleasure to have you in the chair this evening, and thanks go to my honourable friend from North Ayrshire and Aaron for bringing this debate, and to the many honourable and right honourable members for interesting and sometimes heartbreaking contributions this evening. Once upon a time, a third of the globe was pink, signifying lands that were part of the British Empire. Of course, some will say that empire was a civilising force, a moral and noble mission even. But there are others, like me, who say that those who defend imperialism are attempting to justify the exploitation of people and resources, of airbrushing from history the violence that was committed with the aim of expanding British capitalist influence across the globe. Ms Butler, to accurately analyse the current dire humanitarian situation in Palestine, then it is only right to acknowledge 1. Britain's historical role in the region, 2. Britain's current role, and 3. Ongoing imperialism and its indivisible relationship with capitalism. Britain owes a historical debt to the Palestinian people. The Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate of 1922 to 1948, the confiscation of land and the suppression of freedom and human rights that followed. Britain paved the way for today's apartheid living conditions. And now our current role is to perpetuate and normalise the ongoing occupation and colonisation of Palestine. And I'm afraid Britain cannot truthfully say that we are fulfilling our humanitarian obligations when we continue to sell arms to a state that commits genocide. We are in the scandalous position where we train IDF soldiers, soldiers of an army that commit war crimes. And we won't tell our people what we are facilitating from RAF Akrotiri, hiding behind the veil of national security and secrecy. The military support we continue to give Israel makes a mockery of our humanitarian obligations. And by continuing to trade with Netanyahu's murderous regime, then we serve to boost their economy. Netanyahu's government has, by design, crippled the Palestinian economy by impacting their ability to trade, thus making Palestinians reliant on Israel for goods, produce, and ultimately survival. Israel consistently used economic terrorism as a tool of subjugation. The reality is that there is a concerted effort to normalise Palestinians' reliance on Israel as the providers of life-saving aid, while making it near impossible for Palestinians to be self-sufficient, as well as this collective punishment of Palestinians. Another goal of this broader plan is to impose capitalism through the imperial project that the Israeli government promotes, willfully aided by Western democracies. Let's now look at what has happened to Palestinian agriculture. Israel has seized farmland, killed crops, destroyed livestock, stopped farmers from trading and halted their produce reaching markets by putting up and erecting roadblocks. This has led to mass unemployment as farms have become unsustainable. It has reduced agriculture to around 4% of Palestine's GDP. Once, it was 52%. By continuing to trade with Israel, we are complicit in the ongoing colonisation of Palestine, of making Palestinians reliant on Israel. And on a different topic, what of education as a method of improving Palestinians' life chances? Something that we are fortunate in this country to consider a right, not a privilege. Ms Butler, a fortnight ago I was in the West Bank. I heard about the slow strangulation of education. Israel continue to segregate Palestinian education by way of armed checkpoints, roadblocks that stop children and students from going to school, college or university in the West Bank. Meanwhile, in Gaza, school often consists of teachers taking classes in tents as makeshift classrooms because schools have been relentlessly bombed. By trying to fragment and ultimately eradicate education, then Israel is trying to suppress Palestinian national identity and the ability of people to organise and resist the occupation of their land. By allowing this to happen, then Britain and others are not fulfilling humanitarian obligations. We all know that there are players in the international community who will always strive to maintain a capitalist and imperialist agenda at the expense of humanitarian needs. And the stark truth is that Britain is both complicit and guilty in this. Parliamentarians often try and convince ourselves and others that Britain is doing everything we can, that we are on the side of humanity, that we are decent people, part of a civilised society. But I'm sorry, if anyone really thinks Britain is achieving that and actually doing what is right, of doing everything that we possibly can, then they are either blind or they are an obedient fool.
Thank you. Uma Kamaran.
Thank you, Ms Butler, for your chairship. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. Some 18 years ago, I was her researcher, so it's nice that she hasn't shown favouritism in calling me. I thank my honourable friend for North Ayrshire and Aaron for opening this debate. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of constituents in Stratford and Bow, over 1,000 of whom have signed this petition calling for this debate. It puts us in the top 10 signatories in the country. Many, several hundreds more have written to me about Palestine in the past few months alone, and it consistently remains the top issue in my inbox since I was elected. After 2 long and brutal years of unrelenting suffering and bombardment, this ceasefire has come as a welcome relief to millions of Palestinians, and it's a moment I know that many of us in this room have long called for. I was in the West Bank earlier this year, and I know how perilous this past 2 years have been for Gazans, not just in Gaza, but also those in the West Bank. Chair, we speak of a ceasefire, but this weekend, Israeli strikes across Gaza killed 22 Palestinians, bringing the total to over 300 Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes since the ceasefire came into force. That includes 2 children killed every single day. And even in this ceasefire, Israeli authorities continue to thwart humanitarian access and block aid. As we've heard, there are devastating shortages of food, medicine and life-saving supplies, which have spent months sat at warehouses. We've seen Israeli authorities denying and delaying nearly 1 million bottles of baby formula for infants born into famine, and denying entry to the syringes needed to protect the 20% of toddlers in Gaza who've not been vaccinated against polio, measles or pneumonia. Families are facing extreme food shortages. Gaza's health system is collapsing, leaving children without care. And we've heard conditions today, how stark they are when winter is drawing in and the tents are offering little to no shelter. Chair, humanitarian aid should never be politicised. There is absolutely no justification for these restrictions on vital humanitarian assistance. Yet, when there are such attempts, Israeli authorities claim they only block items which might have dual use or some potential military purpose. But what defence risk is there to vaccinating babies? What possible military use could there be for newborn formula? UNRWA say there's enough aid to feed the entire Gazan population for 3 months waiting in warehouses, ready to enter, yet still not permitted in. Earlier this year, I met a Jordanian delegation who told me there are tons of aid trucks tons of aid in trucks sitting on their borders, not allowed in. At the time of the ceasefire, UNICEF alone had 1,300 trucks sitting ready to bring in tents, nutrition, water and sanitation supplies. They also provide education and recreational kits for children, items like balls and board games, chalk and skipping ropes, none of which have been allowed into Gaza for months. Chair, these children are already facing harsh, devastating consequences of war which will live with them for their lifetimes. What military function does a game of snakes and ladders have? What possible threat is there to Israeli forces from a Palestinian child playing football? Chair, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Fund was a system unable, perhaps unwilling, to distinguish between military threats and humanitarian aid, between weapons and toys. This cannot be a model for future aid delivery. Only an impartial humanitarian regime can deliver relief and dignity for the people of Gaza. It's essential that as this ceasefire is consolidated, as the peace plan is developed, we see unfettered access to humanitarian assistance and a recommitment to humanitarian principles. I join members across the House and those who have spoken today in calling on the UK government to support the restoration of an independent and neutral humanitarian scheme capable of delivering aid safely, effectively and at scale. I echo the call to the Minister to clarify the critical objective of ensuring that British aid charities such as Medical Aid for Palestine and Oxfam can operate freely and without restrictions in Gaza, including unhindered entry for staff, their medical teams, and to take humanitarian supplies in. Chair, we owe it to not look away from the devastation and to bear witness to what has been inflicted on the Palestinian people. We owe it to bear witness to this history, to this ongoing genocide, but also to continue to ensure that Britain plays its full part in the humanitarian assistance and rebuilding of Gaza.
Thank you. Lib Dem spokesperson.
Thank you, Chair, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. This is an important and timely debate, and I thank colleagues for their powerful contributions, and I thank the petitioners and my own, the 479 of my own constituents in Esher and Walton, and those who have written to me about the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. 2 years of a brutal war have unleashed unimaginable suffering. The ceasefire may have quietened the shelling, but it has not rebuilt homes, recovered food supplies, or restored the basic systems needed to sustain life. Violations continue on both sides, and the reality on the ground remains desperate. After an estimated 70,000 deaths, 1 million people are sheltering in overcrowded, unsafe displacement sites, some without shelter, and the entire population is in humanitarian need. Food, water and healthcare networks have broken down. Famine conditions persist in northern areas, driven directly by the obstruction of humanitarian access. Clean water is scarce, disease is spreading, and hospitals across the Strip are shut or barely functioning. Around 17,000 children are orphaned. The atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October were abhorrent, and the violations they have continued to commit, even after the ceasefire, are abhorrent and a complete breach of international humanitarian law. The deliberate murder of civilians, the abduction of hostages, and the refusal to release the remaining deceased hostages are all blatant violations of international humanitarian law. But let me be absolutely clear. What we are seeing in Gaza today is the horrific consequence of what happens when the laws of war are treated as optional. International humanitarian law exists to shield civilians from the worst excesses of war. All parties have a legal and moral duty to uphold it. The International Court of Justice has again confirmed Israel's binding duty as the occupying power to guarantee effective humanitarian access. International humanitarian law in Gaza has been breached and disregarded over the past 2 years. Aid should never have been prevented from entering Gaza. Gaza now needs hundreds of aid trucks every day to meet basic survival needs, but only a fraction is reaching their destination. Barely half of UN humanitarian missions have been permitted to proceed. This is completely unacceptable. We were meant to see the scale up of humanitarian assistance, yet some £50 million in INGO relief sits outside the crossing, unable to enter. Aid agencies warn that without fully opening all land crossings and guaranteeing predictable access, a genuine humanitarian recovery will remain impossible. Thousands need urgent medical evacuation, and only a tiny number have been evacuated since the ceasefire, and winter will make an already dire situation even worse. Several crossings are open for limited humanitarian cargo, but the volumes allowed through fall far short of basic needs, and the vital crossing point at Rafah remains closed, blocking civilian movement entirely, while key internal routes, especially into northern Gaza, are still restricted. We must also acknowledge that some aid has been diverted or obstructed by Hamas, further undermining humanitarian efforts and deepening civilian suffering. But humanitarian access must never be a bargaining chip, never subordinated to political agendas, and never used to engineer local governance outcomes. Its neutrality is the only thing that ensures the protection of civilians. International organisations like the World Food Programme have been absolutely clear. They have the food, they have the staff and the systems ready to deliver at full scale. What they now need is a ceasefire that genuinely upholds and guarantees uninterrupted humanitarian access. And with sustained, predictable access, WFP can feed up to 1.6 million people for 3 months and start restoring Gaza's food systems and dignity through digital payments. But donations to Gaza have fallen sharply since the October ceasefire, creating a catastrophic funding gap just as winter arrived and leaving millions facing hunger, illness and collapsing infrastructure. Since the ceasefire, the UK has provided only £24 million in additional humanitarian aid for Gaza, while UN member states have met just 37% of the $4 billion sought under the 2025 flash appeal to support the 3 million people across Gaza and the West Bank. This comes on top of the wider decision to slash overseas aid to its lowest level this century, with funding for the occupied Palestinian territories falling sharply, 21% smaller than last year. Countries like Germany and Ireland are stepping up with more serious humanitarian leadership. They have shown greater urgency. The UK should be doing the same. Our people are no less generous than those countries. The British care deeply about Gaza, as has been shown by this petition. And at a moment like this, Britain should also be at the vanguard of diplomatic efforts. The government must be engaging proactively with our international partners. So can the Minister tell us what conversations the UK is currently having with the Israeli government to get aid in, and what conversations with the United States, with our European allies and with other like-minded partners to secure unhindered humanitarian access into Gaza? And what diplomatic conversations are underway to ensure that all parties comply with the international law and allowed aid to reach civilians without obstruction? And it is vital that UN agencies are not scapegoated or weakened at the very moment that they are most needed. The UK must be unequivocal. We stand with the UN system, including UNRWA, whose removal without a viable alternative will plunge millions deeper into crisis. We cannot allow humanitarian agencies to be dismantled in the middle of a catastrophe. The Liberal Democrats believe Britain must reclaim its humanitarian leadership. I therefore urge the Minister to take the following steps. First, that the government restore the legally enshrined target to spend 0.7% of national income on overseas aid. This would restore the UK's ability to deliver life-saving assistance at the scale required. So can the Minister also assure us that there will be no further cuts to ODA in the autumn budget or thereafter? And will he also confirm whether he intends to go beyond the £24 million pledged to Gaza since the ceasefire? Second, ensure that life-saving humanitarian aid flows freely into Gaza. The government must use every diplomatic channel to secure the full opening of land crossings, predictable UN approvals, the restoration of Rafah for civilian movement, and an end to the unlawful restrictions that breach international humanitarian law and violate ICJ orders. So how does the UK government plan to engage with the Israeli authorities to ensure neutral, UN-led humanitarian delivery, free from political interference, and to press for all land crossings, including Rafah, to be fully opened so that aid can reach those who need it? And has the government raised the new registration restrictions with the Israeli authorities? And if so, which specific assurances had it sought to ensure that international NGOs are not given more barriers to their work? Third, should access continue to be denied, the UK must work with international partners to secure alternative delivery channels. Britain must coordinate pressure for sustained access to all crossings while in parallel scaling up alternative routes. That requires pressing the Israeli authorities to open the crossings and urging the United States and partners in the region to use their influence to secure predictable humanitarian access. And fourth, the government must continue to push for a lasting two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. Those on all sides must be held accountable for war crimes. And while we hold our breath on Gaza, violence and restrictions in the West Bank have sharply escalated. It has become deeply alarming and continues to deteriorate. More than 1.2 million people there need assistance, around 40,000 are displaced, and over 200 Palestinians, including around 50 children, have been killed this year, alongside Israeli casualties from attacks. Large-scale Israeli operations, ongoing demolitions and severe movement restrictions are driving further displacement and disruption, and settler violence remains at crisis levels, with repeated attacks damaging homes, mosques, vehicles, and further eroding livelihoods. So I ask the government to end all trade with illegal West Bank settlements and insist on full humanitarian access and protection for Palestinian civilians across the West Bank. The situation in Gaza is a moral disaster, one made worse by deliberate choices. This is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. Britain must lead with aid, with diplomacy, with integrity, and with urgency to ensure that international humanitarian law is upheld, civilians are protected, and ensure that this country is remembered as one that chose to act, not one that chose to look away. Thank you.
Petitions spokesperson.
Thank you, Ms Butler, for chairing the debate this afternoon, and to Ms McVeigh before you. And of course, it's been a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And may I also thank the Honourable Member for North Ayrshire and Arran for bringing this debate to the floor of the House on behalf of the 198,966 people who signed the petition 700682. Vast numbers of people, Madam Chairman. And I've listened to this debate very carefully this afternoon, and I have to say I've been moved to hear the passion and the concern, the deeply held, sincere concern from members on all sides of the House this afternoon. Ms Butler, no human being should endure and be subject to the kind of inhumane treatment that we have all seen in Gaza in recent times. And I hope and believe that all of us in this chamber, whether we completely agree or not, we all want the same outcome. We want peace and stability returned, and particularly women and children that have suffered and others to live in peace, to return to normal life. And we all want to see that, whatever our opinions are. And I'd like to thank all honourable and right honourable members that have spoken this afternoon. Of course, I'm always moved by the Honourable Member for Islington North, who I avidly listen to whenever he speaks. We don't agree on much, but we do agree on some things. And particularly like to thank my neighbour, member for Ilford North, who spoke earlier. We share the same part of Essex, East London, and we have constituents who have similar views on many issues. So I'd like to thank everybody. I'm not going to refer to everyone this afternoon, but I would like to speak on behalf of His Majesty's opposition. And so, Ms Butler, let me firmly put on record my support and the support of His Majesty's most loyal opposition for President Trump's peace plan for Gaza. As I said during the Foreign Secretary's statement last week, the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2803 represents a major step towards restoring order, security, and, I believe, a pathway to peace. And I sincerely hope that prosperity will be returned and peace for all the people of Gaza as a result of this. The United States has brought leadership, and the United Kingdom must stand shoulder to shoulder with our closest allies, especially the United States and Israel. If we are to have any hope of ending this conflict and building something better. So since becoming Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, I have not yet had the opportunity to speak on this subject. It's always been other Shadow Ministers that have spoken instead of me. So I'd like to put on record that I've always believed that Hamas, which is an Iranian satellite and a terrorist organisation responsible for atrocity upon atrocity, which culminated in October the 7th, can play no part whatsoever in the future governance of Gaza, let alone a part in civilised global politics. I'm glad that many members this afternoon said things along those lines. Their contempt for human life and human dignity is matched only by what it appears to be their absolute hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And indeed, from what I can see, the wider free world. We have nothing in common with Hamas. Their repeated rejection of peace proposals, their game playing over the release of deceased hostages, and their brutal campaign and summary executions against Palestinian civilians tell us everything we need to know, of course.
thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that we can, in this place, and we should, condemn all acts of horror, terrorism and injustice anywhere and everywhere, whether it's Hamas perpetrating it or Israel?
I hate what I've seen on our television screens over the last over 2 years, and I condemn all unwarranted acts of violence. Self-defence, we understand, and we're deeply sad to see what is happening. We all want to see an end to this, and I absolutely respect the honourable gentleman's position on this and agree with him. But Hamas seeks only chaos. They are completely uninterested, from what I can see, in coexistence with Israel. And so, Ms Butler, I understand the strength of feeling expressed by the petitioners and by many honourable members in the chamber this afternoon. No one can fail to be moved by the scale of suffering endured by innocent Palestinians. However, any approach that sidelines Israel will do nothing to get aid over the borders. All crossings, with the exception of Rafah, border Israel. So there has to be cooperation with Israel to get aid into Palestine. And the UK, I believe, must work with Israel to ensure that aid is flowing through the crossings effectively, safely and securely. Last week, the Foreign Secretary mentioned that she is working with her Israeli counterparts on the reopening of certain crossings into Gaza. And so what is the government proposing specifically for each of the individual crossing points? I'm sure the Minister will answer that question later on. And my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, is currently visiting Israel at the moment, where she is seeing for herself the humanitarian aid operation at the Karem Shalom crossing, where trucks have been crossing through into Gaza, aid supplies coming from Israel, the World Food Programme and partners in the region, like the UAE, are all taking part. So some aid, maybe not all of it, but a lot of aid is getting through. She has also met with COGAT, and I believe she is the first British parliamentarian to visit the CMCC, where she met with General Frank, who is heading up the operations to implement the 20-point plan. Such is the importance that this side of the House places on the ceasefire, ensuring humanitarian aid gets into Gaza and that Hamas is eliminated so the region can have the promise of a more peaceful and secure future. The CMCC and COGAT are focused on getting 4,200 aid trucks into Gaza each week. So, can the Minister confirm that this level of humanitarian assistance is getting through? Does he recognise the aid supply from figures from COGAT? Does he agree with those figures? We often hear ministers quote the UN figures, but will the Minister tell us whether he accepts that COGAT efforts are bringing in thousands of trucks of aid a week of humanitarian supplies in using vital winterisation supplies? And so also, can the Minister tell the House whether he or the Foreign Secretary have any plans to follow in the footsteps of the Shadow Foreign Secretary and visit CMCC and meet with COGAT? If they have not done so already, it is vital they do so, and that they visit soon, given we are in the plans going forward. Now, the previous government did everything in its power to increase humanitarian access. Working with allies, they did secure commitments from the government of Israel to open Ezra Crossing and the port of Ashdod to get aid into Gaza. Israel also agreed to extend the opening hours of the Karem Shalom crossing point, and they were able to achieve commitments to increase the number of trucks entering Gaza. And for a period, we saw an increase in the quantity of aid delivered. The United Kingdom supplied vital food and medical aid for innocent Palestinians. And with the help of the UN and Cyprus, we managed to secure infrastructure, including the floating pier off the coast, to help get aid into the territory. I respect that this is an immensely complicated and tragic situation, but the government needs to be focused on practical and even novel solutions for getting round the bottlenecks. Regarding UNRWA, we must not forget that it had to fire 9 staff after investigations into their involvement in the appalling attack on Israel on the 7th of October. The testimony of Emily Damari about the location of her captivity is incredibly serious. All links to the Hamas terrorist group must, I believe, be severed by UNRWA. It is critical that the UN bodies ensure adequate vetting of personnel and activities, and that Catherine Colonna's reforms must be fully implemented as soon as possible. And I hope the Minister would accept that Hamas have been using aid as a weapon, stealing and hoarding it, preventing Gazans from receiving aid, and then profiteering from its sale. That is wholly unacceptable. And so what constructive steps is the government taking with international partners to address aid diversion? At the heart of President Trump's peace plan is the establishment of an international stabilisation force. And the United Kingdom has world-class peacekeeping, policing and stabilisation expertise. And so will the Minister confirm that British expertise will not be wasted and that we have a plan to support the creation of this force alongside our allies? And does the Minister have a view on what the ISF operating parameters should be? And also, does he think that they should move into the red zone? And on the rebuilding of Gaza, what actions are the UK taking to support the establishment of alternative safe communities? It is widely acknowledged that if the current ceasefire is to turn into a sustainable end to conflict, Hamas must be removed from power and its terrorist infrastructure must be dismantled. What we need to hear today is how the government intends to work with regional partners, Israel, Egypt, the UAE and the emerging Palestinian security structures to achieve that essential objective, and Britain to play its part in creating security, peace and stability, and to give the people of Palestine and Israel and the whole of that region hope for the future.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Ms Butler. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for North Ayrshire and Aaron for opening this debate, and I want to thank every member who's spoken with such clarity and conviction. I was asked a number of questions over the 2.5 hours. If colleagues will permit me, I intend to make a brief statement about the humanitarian situation before taking any interventions. I know that the voices in this chamber echo the deep concern felt across the country. Concern so strong that nearly 200,000 people signed the petition that brought us here today, including many of my own constituents in Lincoln. I know, as my honourable friend from Rochdale says, this is not at all a fringe concern. It's on the minds of constituents of us all right across the country. The ceasefire was achieved with great difficulty and in the face of great danger. It must hold. We must confront the humanitarian catastrophe which continues in Gaza. We must see the bodies of the hostages return to their grieving families. And we must move quickly from phase 1 to phase 2, reconstruction and recovery, to rebuild shattered lives. But as we take peace plans forward, we must not lose focus on the catastrophic humanitarian situation. More than 69,000 people have lost their lives since October 2023. Tens of thousands have been wounded, most of them women and children. Over 90% of the population remains displaced. And so our immediate priority must be aid, rapid, sustained and unrestricted. The international system can deliver at scale, but that is not happening on the ground. As we speak, vital equipment and field hospitals are waiting just miles away, blocked by red tape. Winter, as many contributions have made clear, is closing in, and displaced families need shelter and basic services restored. The Israeli authorities must open all crossings without delay, and aid agencies and NGOs must be able to operate freely across the whole of Gaza. Restrictions on UNRWA and other UN agencies must be lifted. The system exists. The supplies exist. I was pleased to hear other colleagues who have seen them in Al Arish, as I have. The will in the UK exists. If the ceasefire and the 20-point plan are to succeed, the political bloc on aid must end. I understand the frustration of my colleagues expressed tonight, but let me reassure the House that the government is doing all it can to support the ceasefire and get aid into Gaza. We have allocated £78 million for humanitarian and recovery support this year, including £20 million for water, sanitation and hygiene services. Over the past 2 years, we've restored funding to UNRWA and provided nearly £250 million in development assistance. The Honourable Gentleman challenges whether or not this has made any difference to individuals in Gaza. It's 439,000 people who have received essential health care. 647,000 have received food. Over 300,000 have gained access to clean water and sanitation. Many of the contributions have rightly challenged me and the government to consider the individuals at the heart of this rather than the numbers. I was in Yemen last week and saw a malnourished child in front of me at one of the healthcare clinics, which we are supporting. The sight of an 11-month-old baby severely malnourished is a truly arresting sight, and it is a reminder to me, as I know it is to everyone in this House, that there are thousands such children in Gaza. We must do everything that we can to ensure that the ceasefire holds and that the aid gets in. We have deployed UK advisors to the Civil Military Coordination Centre to help coordinate reconstruction and humanitarian efforts. In total, we are providing £116 million this year for humanitarian aid, economic development and strengthening PA governance and reform.
I believe it was announced today that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is ceasing operations, and they've said that they have shared lessons with the CMCC. Does the Minister think it's important that we learn what not to do in delivering aid? Because I think we have seen that the best way to do that is through recognised organisations such as the UN, and I wondered if you might comment on the GHF statement today.
I thank my honourable friend for that important contribution. I've been absolutely clear throughout the GHF was no way to deliver aid. The cost to the people of Gaza was absolutely clear from the grim images that we saw day in and day out of its operation. It has always been the case that a system exists in order to provide aid across Gaza. Not a perfect system. Where there are abuses of that system, of course they need to be investigated. I am very glad to hear from our partners that the amount of looting of aid has considerably reduced following the ceasefire. But the system exists, the aid exists, it's the United Nations system, it's mentioned specifically in the 20-point plan, and that is how aid must be distributed across Gaza, both... I will.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that he has said, and I applaud much of it. About the restrictions of aid in Gaza are utterly reprehensible. But what happened, and there's been multiple calls in this chamber for action, but what happens? What's the plan if Israel says no? If Israel says it is not allowing unfettered access to humanitarian aid, what do we do in that situation?
I thank the honourable gentleman. It's perhaps helpful for the House if I set out what the UK sees as unfettered access. So there are 3 areas where our advocacy is particularly focused. One is on the issue that's been raised by many colleagues about the registration provisions around NGOs, an issue which we have raised directly with the Israeli government, as one of the honourable members was asking during their intervention. The second is in relation to dual-use items. There has been an overly restrictive approach to dual-use items that has restricted, in particular, shelter, but a whole range of other things, whether it's the equipment for water purification, a whole range of medical supplies. That dual-use list must be considerably loosened in order to enable the kind of operations that so many honourable members have discussed. And the third, and perhaps turning to some of the comments from His Majesty's opposition, the third is, of course, in relation to the crossings. There are 2 crossings open, as I understand the Shadow Foreign Secretary has seen during her recent visits, but there remain very significant crossings which are still closed. They are both the Allenbury crossing into Jordan and the Rafah crossing. These are 2 absolutely critical crossings. Their opening was very clearly envisaged in the 20-point plan and is on that point that we continue to press the Israeli government. The opening of those crossings is also related to some of the important points that were made by honourable members about both aid access going in, but also those coming out. I have told honourable members before that I don't wish to be drawn on specific numbers of those that we have assisted to leave Gaza, both medically injured children and students. I know many honourable members in this chamber now have discussed some of these questions with me, and for those who I have outstanding questions to answer, you have my word that I will come back to them quickly. I can say that after the most recent wave of evacuations, we have now exceeded the target that I mentioned to some of you in recent months. We have, after a series of evacuation operations, managed to save hundreds from what awaited them in Gaza, to provide opportunities to take up here in the UK. And I take the point that the honourable gentleman and others have made, that they would like to see larger numbers. There is a balance to be struck here. Clearly, medical assistance is most effective, most timely in Gaza itself, both sides of the yellow line. After that, it is most effective in the region, and I was pleased to be in Cairo recently seeing some of that provision. But where that assistance cannot be provided, then it is appropriate that we look at specialist cases, as we have done. I will very briefly, and then I'll wrap up.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate it. We've been talking about the desperate need for unfettered aid access into Gaza for desperate, starving civilians. At the same time, this country continues to provide completely unfettered access, trade access for settlement goods into this country, proceeds of crime, literally. Is it not time for the British government to ban trade in settlement goods? And might not that help put a little bit of pressure on the Israeli government to allow aid into Gaza?
Madam Chair, as the Honourable Lady knows, there is not unfettered trade with the occupied territories. They are not subject to the same trade arrangements as Israel, and where there are breaches, we will investigate those thoroughly. We have discussed many times some of the challenges around ensuring that the goods produced in the occupied territories do not find their way into the mainstream Israeli trading system. But I don't have the time, I'm afraid, to rehearse some of those arguments again this afternoon. I'll close by saying the government understands the urgency of the humanitarian situation in Gaza on both sides of the yellow line. His Majesty's opposition asks whether or not we want to see the international system into what some are calling the red zone, west of the yellow line. And indeed we do. It is absolutely vital. That is where 90% of Gaza's population remains to this day. Humanitarian provision on the east of the yellow line cannot make a dent in the very significant humanitarian suffering that so many have described so eloquently this afternoon. The most recent figures that we have is that the amount of famine is reducing, the amount of severe malnutrition has decreased since the ceasefire, but it is still far, far too high. And I give this House my solemn commitment and that of the government that we will not rest until humanitarian aid is into Gaza in the volumes required to try and meet the staggering level of human suffering that so many have talked about with such power this afternoon.
Thank you.
Irene Campbell to wind up.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. I'd like to thank members who have contributed to this very important and significant debate today, and I thank the Minister for his response. As we have heard today, the situation in Gaza is devastating. While the ceasefire offers some hope and it must hold, it is important that we recognise this cannot be the final step and much, much more must be done. A significant increase in humanitarian aid must enter Gaza, and we must remember that the UK has a legal obligation to respect international humanitarian law. I would like to thank the petitioner for creating this petition and the almost 200,000 people who signed and ensured that this debate took place today. And finally, I would like to finish by thanking the Petitions Committee staff who worked tirelessly to brief and assist us in preparations for these petitions debates every week.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 700682 relating to humanitarian obligations and Gaza. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.